Part two of today's show, Trevor, and I'm not quite sure if we're going to be able to get to a mailbag today. I hope we can, but that segment went a lot longer than we thought it was going to be because there's some very good conversation.
Yeah.
Part two of this is going to say, let's look back at Notre Dame's portal classes and kind of talk about where this one stacks up against those units. And we will look at it from a standpoint of what we know, not so much what we thought about units before, because it doesn't matter. We know what those units were. We don't know what this one will be. But it's saying, can this unit provide what past units have? And when you look over the years, Trevor, and you look back, obviously you had Alohi Gilman that shows up back in 2017 and the impact he had. Notre Dame's had some transfers in the past. You go back to even Cody Riggs, turned out to be a huge pickup for Notre Dame in 2014 because Kavari Russell eventually got suspended. He was going to be the nickel. He has to turn into a starter, had an impactful season then. So there have been, over the years, Notre Dame has landed transfers before. But obviously in recent years, that's ramped up a little bit with the current portal. And it began with the graduate rules that started back in the 20-teens, where if you're a graduate, you get a transfer right away and play right away. That was the first portal change or transfer change, which is one that I've always supported. I think there should always be rewards for getting your degree as a student athlete.
Yeah.
And that is one of them that I fully support. And so that was sort of the early impact in the portal. So you go back to from 2020 till now, when we really started to see multiple guys per year in most instances. In 2020, you had Ben Skoranek and Nick McLeod and Isaiah Pryor. I think those were very impactful players. I would say it's fair to say that if they don't come to Notre Dame, I don't know that Notre Dame runs the table that year, especially with Nick McLeod. I thought he was so important to that team. 2021, they get Kane Madden. I believe he was their only major portal pickup that offseason. The next year, they get Brandon Joseph, which was expected to be a huge portal pickup, didn't turn out that way. They get Chris Smith from Harvard, which nobody really talked about when they got him. Turned out to be a very important piece of that defensive line rotation, especially when Jacob Lacey quit on the team in September, decided to redshirt and transfer. They also got John Sott at punter, who had a really good year for Notre Dame punting that year. And then Blake Rupe, who was very solid for Notre Dame, is now in the NFL. The next year, bigger class, Devin Ford, Caleb Smith, Javante Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper, Antonio Carter, Spencer Schrader. Very hit or miss class. And didn't quite give the impact that we hoped it would. Obviously, Caleb Smith quit the team even before the spring ended. Antonio Carter never made an impact and transferred out after 1 year. Thomas Harper had a heck of an impact that year. Spencer Schrader, hit or miss. When he hit, boy, it was a thing of beauty. When he missed, it was like, how did you miss a 31-yarder in the same game you made a 58-yarder? I don't understand what's going on right now.
When Spencer Schrader hit, he literally hit, and when he missed, he literally missed.
Oh, it was just like bad. It was it was bad. And then Javante Jean-Baptiste was a heck of a pickup for Notre Dame that year. And Thomas Harper was outstanding. Devin Ford was a quality rotation running back. I mean, I still think of him serving as a lead blocker against Ohio State. Then this past year, and we're not forgetting certain guys. We're leaving a certain position out for now. Then you look at this last year's class. Bo Collins, starter for Notre Dame. Chris Mitchell starts at times. Jaden Harrison, primary kick returner. RJ Oben, starting defensive end. Jordan Clark, starting nickel. Rod Hurd, rotation safety. And then Derek Jeter. Mitch Jeter is your primary kick returner. This is the class that offered the most starters of any of the past portal classes. It had some impact moments, certainly for Notre Dame, and then it had an impact beyond the scholarship guys. Jake Defelsky was a special teams guy for Notre Dame this year, but then even more so Max Hurleman, who comes to Notre Dame as a running back, moves to DB, and then eventually takes over as your starting return guy. And then I was looking at this earlier, Trev, and I thought I saw he had something like almost 300 special team snaps for Notre Dame this year because Max Hurleman played on all the special teams. Yeah, it was 252. He had 43 snaps on kick return, 102 on kick coverage, 66 on punt return as the punt returner, 40 on punt coverage, and then he was once on field goal block. So, and you're talking about a guy that as a walk-on was one of your best special teams players. You can't ignore that impact in the transfer portal. So I would argue that top to bottom, this past year's transfer class was Notre Dame's best, leaving out quarterbacks. 23, maybe you could debate was there. But what we've seen, Trev, and you made this point before we started the show, they've been able to add impact players through the portal over the years. Nick McLeod, no question about it. Ben Skoranek, at times, certainly. Chris Smith was a really good rotation player that was impactful in that he gave them really quality minutes at a position that was somewhat depleted had he not been there. You look at Thomas Harper, certainly an impact pickup. Javonte Jean-Baptiste, certainly an impact pickup. And then last year, I think Bo Collins is an impact pickup. He had some big moments, but also if he's not there, who's playing that position? Jaden Harrison didn't have the impact we hoped he would have until the playoffs. RJ Oben didn't have the impact we thought he would have until the playoffs. Same game. So at times, and then Jordan Clark I thought was better than I thought he was going to be. So, but what we didn't have was necessarily, there wasn't that one guy, in my opinion, that had like a Javonte Jean-Baptiste type of impact, or even a Thomas Harper type of impact, a Nick McLeod type of impact. But from a depth standpoint, I think it was certainly your best portal class so far. Now Notre Dame goes into a year where they're hoping to get, and this is, and I'll kick this over to you because you made this statement to me when we were preparing for the show, is the difference between this class and past classes is, even if you look at last year's class, I don't know that anybody thought Bo Collins, we had hoped he could maybe show something, but we never really saw it. Chris Mitchell, maybe, with some of that. RJ Oben, we thought he could be a good player, maybe be a Javonte Jean-Baptiste. I didn't expect a ton out of Jordan Clark. Thought Rod Hurd would be a solid player, but he was making a position switch. There's much more potential for impact players in this class than we've seen, in my opinion. But the question is, will it be that? But I do want to talk about that first, Trevor, is when you compare this class to past portal classes, we're going to leave out quarterbacks because for obvious reasons. When you're just looking at this position players, can this class provide you what past classes have and then some? Because in this class, I think you're asking it to, where you didn't necessarily ask it to in past years.
I think that's the biggest thing when you look at this incoming class for 2025 of transfers is they're filling positions of need, and not that previous classes hadn't. But you look at some of the upper tiered, almost game changer type of players that Notre Dame has picked up in the transfer portal before. They had to be that. When I look at last year's portal class, Chris Mitchell didn't have to be a game changer of a player for Notre Dame's offense to be effective based on what it had over the course of the season. The stable of running backs, a mobile quarterback, tight end room at times, and then other receivers that you had. Jaden Greathouse, Jordan Faison were both back. You had Bo Collins as your starting boundary. But then you go and you look at defensive end. RJ Oben, I think, was probably the most underwhelming of last year's portal class. Still played well, just wasn't the game changer, game wrecker that people thought that he was going to be. But then you look at other positions in previous years. Javonte Jean-Baptiste was coming in to replace Isaiah Foskey, who was coming off of back-to-back double-digit sack seasons. Didn't get to double-digit sacks, but he had a great season for Notre Dame in 23. You look at previous years, Ben Skoranek. Javon McKinley needed another addition to that receiver room to complement him, and Ben Skoranek was able to do that. So all of the impact players that Notre Dame has had in previous classes were because they needed them to be. And that's how I look a lot of this 2025 class. Malachi Fields comes in, and he has the skills, the tools to be an impact player. Also, Notre Dame needs him to be an impact player in the boundary because they don't have anybody on their roster that's 6'4", 220, and that can play like him. You need Devontae Smith to come in and be an impact player at nickel, because outside of that, you have a converted safety in Ben Minnick and Carson Hobbs, who started playing that position not that long ago. Didn't have my watch on today.
I just still like that you thought you could look at your watch and be like, about 10 minutes ago, basically. Yeah, I agree.
So this class has a very high ceiling for impact potential. Like we alluded to in the previous segment, little ways to go, but they're starting off on a really strong foot.
When you talk about expectations, Trevor, I think the discussion primarily, I love the point you made about had to, because one thing that's different about this portal class, to your point, is it has more upside talent, more impact talent, more high-level talent. Like Nick McLeod was a godsend for Notre Dame in 2020, but he went undrafted. He wasn't Benjamin Morrison. He wasn't Cam Hart. He wasn't Julian Love. He was way better than what they would have had otherwise, and he had a really good year, but you could even see, like in the Bama game, that he wasn't on that level. But for that team, huge impact on that team. Ben Skoranek had like 20-some catches. There for like 400-some yards. There was a conversation that somebody had in the chat, and they said, who was Notre Dame's best portal receiver? And somebody said it's Ben Skoranek. And I said, yeah, I think Ben Skoranek's in the conversation. But Ben Skoranek that year missed a couple games because of an injury, had 29 catches for 439 yards and 5 touchdowns. In some areas, he was better than Bo Collins. In others, he wasn't. Bo Collins didn't miss a single game, answered the bell every week, had 41 catches, 490 yards, so more catches, more yards. He had 3 touchdowns, less touchdowns, obviously. But he answered the bell every week, just like Ben Skoranek, blocked very well, and had, just like Ben Skoranek, had some big-time moments also. I think the difference between Bo and Ben is I think Bo's biggest moments were in the biggest games. Like Bo frustrated me against Stanford. Bo frustrated me against Virginia. Like, dude, like, come on, man. Like, you got to be better than that. But Bo stepped up against Texas A&M. Bo stepped up against Georgia as a blocker, and then the one time he gets targeted makes a big play. Bo stepped up in some of those bigger moments this season when you needed him to step up and make plays. And that's something that I appreciate. Now, it's not that Ben didn't do that. It's just he didn't really have, like the Pitt game was like his biggest game, and Pitt, they won that game 45-3, and Pitt wasn't very good. That was a very weak schedule until the postseason. And he was solid in the postseason. He got like 4 catches against Clemson and then 4 against Bama and all that. But I still think Bo had the biggest impact and certainly the most production, more games, but still the most production. And so, but the point is when you're debating between a guy that had 41 catches for 490 yards and a guy that had 29 catches for 400-some yards, it's kind of like, that's not super impactful. Like that's not like, wow, holy moly, how did you ever succeed without that guy? It just isn't that. And what you're adding in this class is a guy that potentially could be that. And with Bo, it was, and Ben, it was always, I hope that they can do this, this, and this, but we hadn't actually seen it. You hope that Bo could go beyond what he had done in his career, which is essentially what he did last year, 35 to 40 catches, 400 to 500 yards and 3 to 5 touchdowns. It's kind of his range. What Ben Skoranek did for Notre Dame in 2020 was basically what he had done at at Northwestern. Year before he was hurt, so you don't count that, but he was like 45 for 562, 45 for 644, 5 touchdowns. And so you're like, he basically was on a per game basis, because again, he played more games in those years. To give some context, so like in 2017, he had 644 yards, which is obviously much more than the 439 it had at Notre Dame, but he was at 49.5 yards per game. The next year when he had 562 yards, he was at 40.1 yards per game. In 2020, he was at 43.9 yards per game. So the raw number is a little misleading because he played like 13 and 14 games those 2 years. Only played 10 in 2020. On a per game basis, he was basically identical to what he was at Northwestern. Okay, that's fair. Bo Collins, if he's identical to what he was at Virginia, is a much more impactful player than those other 2 guys were. That's the expectation. And that's what I say is like, I don't need any of these guys to be better than what they were. I just need them to be what they were. Even Javonte Jean-Baptiste, who I had said earlier, I don't know that anyone's necessarily been better than what they were at the other school. Javonte Jean-Baptiste is the one guy you could argue was, but I would simply say he just simply showed that he could do what he did at Ohio State with more when he was used more, because he had a very good production per snap rate at Ohio State. That's one of the things I talked about coming into that season was his success that year. I mean, coming into that year, his success at Ohio State, he didn't play a lot, but when he played, he made plays. He had a very high, sack, per snap rate, that type of thing. So what he did in Notre Dame was show that he could play. He could do that with more volume. He could maintain that playmaking with more volume. And it was a blessing for Notre Dame. They needed him to be that kind of player. Thomas Harper was at Notre Dame what he was at Oklahoma State, which is a really good nickel corner or nickel safety. And same thing last year. I mean, nobody played like Jordan Clark to me is probably one that I would say I didn't think what he did at Arizona State was going to translate overly well to Notre Dame, but it did. It did translate pretty well. So that's how I look at it, Trev, is like I think what you're adding with this portal class is a lot more of a high level impact player, high level players than maybe what you've had in the past. The expectation is, and a lot of it centers around Malachi Fields, who we talked a lot about. But even Jared Dawson, Devontae Smith. You're talking about a guy, I mean, with all due respect to Oklahoma State and Arizona State, those are Power 5 schools. I mean, you played in big games, but you're talking about bringing a guy in from Bama where he's played in the biggest of the biggest moments. You're not bringing him in here to just be a guy. You're hoping he can come to be something different. Jalen Stroman comes in with sort of Brandon Joseph type expectations, much more so than what Rod Hurd and Jordan Clark and Thomas Harper came in with. Can he live up to those expectations or not? That's a question. We don't know the answer to that. Will Pauling, if he is at Notre Dame, what he was at Wisconsin, is significantly more productive than what any of those other receivers were.
Yeah.
That's it. So like the level of what they're bringing in this year outside of quarterback was significantly greater, proven production at the Power 4 level, Chris Mitchell being the exception. But again, Florida International, the proven production is significantly greater, especially the skill positions, than what we've seen. Where in the past it was, I hope he can be better than what he was there. Where now it's like, I just hope he is what he already has shown he can be. That to me is one of the biggest differences.
Well, I think last year the trend kind of ended where Notre Dame brought in some portal players that just kind of fell to the wayside. You go back through and you look at some of these transfer portal classes. 2020, Nick McLeod, Ben Skoranek, great. Isaiah Pryor was a good special teams player, but I don't think they brought him in to just be a special teams player.
They were hoping. It's exactly what they were hoping.
Yeah.
He could be for them what he was in high school.
Yeah.
As a top 100 type of recruit as a safety.
Mm-hmm.
But all he'd ever been at Ohio State was a special teams guy. And he was like a backup nickel and a rotation safety at times, but that's it. Yep. They were hoping he could be more than what he was, but what he was exactly what he was at Ohio State.
Mm-hmm. And then you go and you look at the 2023 class. Yes, Javonte Jean-Baptiste was solid, and he was a great impact player for Notre Dame. Same with Thomas Harper. But then, you had Antonio Carter, Devin Ford, Caleb Smith didn't even make it to the fall, and so
he didn't even make it to the spring game, bro.
That's right. Yeah.
He quit mid-spring. He quit in the middle of a practice. He was like, F it, I'm out. Because him and Chancey Stuckey didn't get along very well. Unlike the young guys who just kind of took his verbal abuse, Caleb Smith was like, I don't need this. I'm out. And just walked out in the middle of practice.
Fair enough.
That was wild.
Fair enough.
Wild.
But, you were there?
No, I heard about it right after. I was like, hey, bro, just so you know, Caleb Smith ain't going to be back. I'm like, what? And he's like, yeah, dude just bounced in the middle of practice. Now, I got more word on kind of what happened later on, but I was like, dude just bounced.
Ooh.
Okay, this will be interesting.
Man. But
Yeah.
But point being, last year was the first year that Notre Dame brought in portal players that all played a role and never kind of drifted away to, oh yeah, he was in the class. You know what I mean? Like I go and I look at even guys like Rod Hurd. Understandably so, he was brought in to kind of line up alongside Xavier Watts. Adon Schuler had the great spring, but Rod Hurd still rotated in and had great play. He had a forced fumble against Virginia. He came in and he had a 4th down pass breakup against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
He still contributed. And I see the same.
At a position he had never played before.
Yes.
He was primarily a nickel at Northwestern. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I see more of the same to a higher degree from this class for all the things that we've talked about. Because 1, they need it. And 2, I think the level of athletes, with all due respect to former portal players, is a grade higher at certain positions. And so top to bottom from this class, it gives you a lot of promise.
But you know what's interesting about it, Trev? And we're gonna kind of go through and say, okay, does it have a chance to be the best portal class so far? What about certain positions? We'll kind of look at it that way. But here's the interesting thing. What I agree with everything you just said. There's more high ceiling talent. There's more established talent in this room than what I think we saw in other years. So yes, RJ Oben was very experienced, but is he any more experienced or proven than what Jared Dawson has been at Louisville? I don't think so. They've both played a lot of ACC snaps, and they have a very similar. I mean, actually, I think the per snap production disruption rates for Jared Dawson is higher than what RJ Oben's was. You look at Theo Riddick. I don't know where that came from. Will Pauling and Malachi Field, significantly more production than anyone else has done at the Power 4 level. You look at Devontae Smith, did it at Bama, and the production is clear there. He didn't do it as much as Rod Hurd played a lot of football at Arizona State. Thomas Harper played a lot of football at Oklahoma State. The other thing is Devontae, he's more of a corner. Those other 2 guys were a bit of a safety. So when I look at this portal class, and Jalen Stroman is, an all ACC type of player, which is kind of somewhat comparable to what Rod Hurd was and what Brandon Joseph was. So when I look at this class, Trev, I agree with you. It's at the minimum at spots the same as other classes, but overall more potential impact. What I find fascinating, however, is outside of really 1, maybe 2 of the guys, this is the year where they're needed the least than in past years. Because what's interesting is the further back you go, the smaller the numbers of the portal class, the more important they were to those teams because of the overall lack of depth and talent on those teams. If Nick McLeod doesn't play for Notre Dame in 2020, that team is screwed at cornerback, especially once Tariq Bracy kind of had his issues in the middle of the season, because you had to then turn to Clarence Lewis. What do you do if Clarence Lewis can't play? You were in trouble. You go to 2021, all the beef with Caden Madden. I still say they should have played a younger player, but you know what? Caden Madden stepped up and answered the bell every week in a year where not a lot of offensive linemen could step up and answer the bell every week. There was a lot of injuries that year. The next year, Chris Smith, Brandon Joseph, I think overall a very disappointing portal class. And then 23, you have Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper. You needed those guys. You didn't really have a whole lot of options if they don't play. And Antonio Carter wasn't really needed. He was a guy that was that you're going to be a rotation guy, and then hopefully the next year would have a chance to start. Didn't work out that way. Obviously, you needed Caleb Smith. And when him not panning out hurt that team because you had to play a bunch of freshmen. When he decided not to play, you had to then put Jaden Thomas in the boundary. That wasn't his natural position. He got banged up. Then you had to put Jaden Greathouse out there. Like, he would have been your boundary. That hurt that football team. That took a weapon away from Sam Hartman. If he would have stuck it out, he'd have been a good football player for Notre Dame. Even if he just would have repeated what he did at Virginia Tech, Trev, that's still good production because he was kind of a big play guy for Virginia Tech the previous season. Had 37 catches for 674 yards and 3 touchdowns, and I think he was like an honorable mention All-ACC player. That would have been beneficial to that football team and Sam Hartman, who liked to throw the ball down the field. And so when he doesn't pan out, you were kind of in a pickle. And then you look at last year's class, obviously, and we've talked about. So what's interesting with this class is outside of Malachi Fields, I would say that Notre Dame really wants these portal guys to step up. And I would say to a degree they need them to step up. But I would argue that they are clearly in a much better position to thrive if they don't than we've seen in the past. That's the biggest difference between where this team is. And I think what that does is that takes a little bit of, in my opinion, some of the pressure off of the coaches and the portal pickups. Hey, Will Pauling, you don't got to be the second coming of Rocket Ismail at Notre Dame. They don't need you to be that. Just go do your job. You know, even Devontae Smith, who I would argue is probably number 2 behind Malachi Fields. You can maybe argue Jared Dawson in most important, but if you'll have Carson Hobbs, you'll have Ben Minnick, Dallas Golden shows up this summer. He could get a shot at nickel. You could go with the safety, one of your 37 safeties that showed up this spring, and say, I guess we'll just maybe put, Bronte Johnson down there and see how that works. Well, what a tough life that is when you got to throw Bronte Johnson into the game. You know what I mean? So, like, if something happens to Devontae, you may not be as good there, but you're going to kind of be okay. If you don't have Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes, you still have Gabriel Rubio, you still have Donovan Hines, you still have Jason Onye, you still have Armel Mukum, you still have Sean Sevillano, you still have Davion Dixon, you'll still have Brendan Vernon when he gets back from an injury. You're going to be okay. Right? And the only position where you really just don't have anybody else is boundary with Malachi Fields. Mm-hmm. I think that takes a lot of that pressure off, and it takes pressure off of the coaches. We don't have to play Will Pauling 65 snaps in the first game. We can work him in. We don't have to play Jared Dawson for 50 snaps a game because we don't have anybody else like they had to do with Howard Cross a year ago. He can be part of a rotation. I think it takes some of that pressure off them, but also takes pressure off the coaches that they got to force the issue with guys right away to try to make them be dudes. I think that's something to keep an eye on because I think that helps with the psyche of the players as well, and of course of the coaches also.
Well, that goes back to what I was talking about at the start of the show. It's just the transfer portal class is a reflection of how well the high school recruiting is done. Because you've gone from a position of, every single player that we get in the portal has to pan out to, all right, well, if they do, that's great and it elevates the team. But if not, we still have a really, really good football team. And the thing that should leave you the most excited, which leaves me the most excited, is we just got done talking about how this could be the most talented transfer portal class that you've brought in. And they don't need them to all be the best that they possibly can be. And that's exciting. That's really, really exciting.
It's about margin for error, Trev, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to is there's a much broader margin for error with this portal class than in the past.
Oh, yeah.
Where if you don't bat 1,000 or you don't bat 900, you're going to be okay. The better you hit, the better you're going to be. And that's the really interesting thing is on the flip side, if this class does hit and you have all the players you have, now you talk about, could this portal class have a comparable impact to your team to what Ohio State's portal class had for them last year? Ohio State was loaded last year. Do they win the title if they don't get Caleb Downs, if they don't get Quinshaw Junkins, if they don't get Seth McLaughlin? And I know he got hurt late in the year, but he was a very important piece of that puzzle during the year. Do they have the kind of class they have if they don't have the portal? They were small numbers, but big impact.
Yeah. Maybe
they do, but it's much smaller margin for error. That's the point. You look at Notre Dame this past year. If you would they have still been pretty good without any of the guys that we just talked about? Maybe. They'd have been pretty thin on the defensive end position if they didn't have RJ open. But then you throw in Riley Leonard and you're like, no, they wouldn't have been the same team. And so we're taking quarterback, and that's why we're taking quarterback in this equation. because it's hard to argue for a team that a class that didn't need a quarterback with ones that needed a quarterback and landed a quarterback. Because obviously in 2021 it was Kane Madden and Jack Cohn. In 2023 it was Devin Ford, Caleb Smith, Jean Baptiste, Thomas Harper, Antonio Carter Smith-Schrader, and Sam Hartman. This past year's Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, Jaden Harrison, RJ Oben, Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd, Mitch Jeter, Max Hurleman, Jake Tefelsky, and Riley Leonard. Well, this year they don't need a quarterback. So it's hard, it's unfair to stack it up against others that had it. So that's why we're talking about non-quarterbacks in this conversation. And when you talk about impact, none of the portal guys outside of Riley Leonard were star players last year. And the fact that you didn't need him to be, I think, again, took the pressure off. But what did we see? I remember somebody got upset on the board. ESPN wrote an article about transfer portal players basically step up big for Notre Dame against Georgia. And they took that as some sort of like insult, like Notre Dame's players. So I don't take it as an insult. I take it as a statement of fact. I mean, Riley Leonard had a big game against Georgia and only threw for 90 yards. Jaden Harrison had a 97-yard kick return for a touchdown. RJ Hopen had a strip sack that was recovered by Junior Telemaka that resulted in your transfer quarterback hitting your transfer receiver for a touchdown on the very next play. So 2 plays in a row, 3 transfer guys take a 6-3 game and turn it into a 13-3 game. And then on the very next play, basically meaningful down, because I think Georgia took a knee after that, right? So the next meaningful down, another transfer takes a kickback for a touchdown. And your transfer kicker hits a field goal when it's 20-10 that puts the game away. It's okay to say, like, the transfer, it was a statement of fact. It wasn't a shot at the returning players. It's a statement of fact. The transfer players stepped up huge for Notre Dame in that game. And so you can make the case that Notre Dame maybe doesn't go as far as they would have if not for the transfer players. That Notre Dame-Georgia game looks a whole lot different if it's 13-6 when Georgia gets their first possession of the second half than if it's 20-6, like it was because of Jaden Harrison's return. And I think Max Hurleman had a big block on that. So did, I think, Luke Talich and Max Hurleman. I could be wrong on that, but I thought Max Hurleman had a big block on that return also. But anyway, so like last year's class obviously had a big impact. Can this year's class have a comparable impact? That's the question. And so as we evaluate, Trev, let's evaluate these 2 classes. When you look at the offensive class, it's Malachi Fields, Will Pauling, Ty Washington. How does that group compare to last year's class based of Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, and Jaden Harrison? And I think it's in some ways it is very comparable. It's 3 pass catchers and 3 pass catchers. I think last year, all 3 you expected to get something from, which is a benefit over this year's class. I don't know that we expect anything out of Ty Washington. We don't know. We hope, but it's not an expectation. Whereas last year, you knew a minimum you were going to get this. You knew that the 3 receivers were all going to have a shot to be in the rotation in some capacity. 2 of them thought were going to start, and they ultimately kind of did. And then you hope that Jaden Harrison could give you a little bit of receiver, but definitely impact in the special teams. What's interesting is until the Georgia game, his biggest impacts that season had been as a receiver. When you think of, obviously, the big catch against Louisville for a big play, and I'm trying to think there was another game. So Florida State, he had a big catch in that game. Like he
played well against Virginia.
Yep, that's another one. Who should have had about a 70-yard touchdown against Virginia. They got called back over a BS penalty. So it was a legit penalty, but it was BS that he did it. It was just one of those dumb penalties. It's like, why'd you do that? It's like the penalty Blake Fisher had that brought back that go ball to Mitchell Evans in 2023 against Louisville. So I think the depth was more proven in that last year's class. I think there's more high upside, proven production in this class. If you could say, okay, give me last year's receivers with this offense or this year's receivers and Ty Washington with this offense, of what we know about the group we saw last year compared to what we hope from this group, Trev, who are you taking?
I'm taking this year's receiver class, pass catching class. And honestly, I'd be as bullish to say, based on just having Malachi Fields alone, if I'm looking at this big picture with both classes. And I say that because, yes, there was a question around who was going to be the boundary receiver. Bo Collins didn't come in and step in and answer the bell every single week. But as far as skill set goes, his skill set was relatively similar to Jaden Greathouse's. He was just 2 inches taller. But Malachi Fields, to me, brings an aspect to this team that they
you talking about Bo Collins?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And then I look at Chris Mitchell. A lot of questions last year about the jump that he was going to have to make from, the group of 4 level up to playing at Notre Dame and that level of competition. And then Jaden Harrison, as we know, was brought in predominantly as a returner, paid off in one of the bigger moments of the season. But
I want to say one thing about that. I think it paid off all year because I think teams were just afraid to kick to Notre Dame all year because of him.
Fair.
They got the ball to 25 a lot more than maybe they would have, where teams might have tried to pin him inside because of his presence. Georgia was dumb enough to say, no, we're not going to do that. And I think it cost them. But I think you do have to kind of look at that. They just gave them no chances to return kicks last year for most of the season.
Oh, yeah, that's very fair. The indirect impact that he had week in and week out, that's absolutely fair. But I think when you look at what Malachi Fields and Will Pauling to boot brings to the table, I would take this receiver pass catcher class, even without factoring in Ty Washington. Because I look at Ty Washington and Jaden Harrison kind of the same on offense, not what their impact could be on special teams, but coming into it's like, yeah, Jaden Harrison probably going to be a part of the rotation, but being a receiver wasn't the strength of his game. It's the fact that he was an All-American returner. And then with Ty Washington, it's like, okay, where do you fit in that rotation? It'll be somewhere, but we don't know where that's going to be yet. So I would take this one kind of just based on Malachi Fields alone.
I think even if you stack up Will Pauling's proven production at the Power 4 level, it's better than what anybody had last year.
Yeah.
And I think you could even say for him the same things about Bo Collins. He's a Jaden Greathouse type of guy. So I do think that interesting. Then you look at the defensive class. Last year, R.J. Oben, Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd. I think we're all impactful players to some degree. Because if you're part of a rotation, you're on a team that's as good as they were on defense, you're an impactful player because you're doing your role well. And I think that's definitely true of the 2 DBs. R.J. Oben was disappointing for most of the year. He wasn't bad. He just didn't do anything. He was not like, boy, they're getting run on because R.J. Oben's terrible. It wasn't anything like that. It just wasn't making any plays. Just kind of did his job until the Georgia game when he stepped up and made a huge game-changing play. You look at Jared Dawson. You look at Elijah Hughes. You look at Devontae Smith and you look at Jalen Stroman, and I think it's a similar case, Trev. It's more high upside proven production than what you got last year, where, Jordan Clark was a very experienced player, but you knew what his limitations were coming in. Rod Hurd was a solid player at Northwestern who was making a position change, who had never really done what you were asking him to do. And then R.J. Oben was also kind of making a change because he was making a scheme adjustment, but that's similar to what other guys are doing. Where when you look at R.J. Oben, it's you had R.J. Oben one year, but you've got Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes in the second class. You had 2 DBs last year, 2 DBs this year. Guy coming in from Bama, who's, I think, a chance to be an impact player. And then you had a guy who's an all-ACC player at Virginia the last time he was playing. So I think this is the side of the ball where it's a little bit more debatable. I agree with you that the offensive one, it's clearly more high-level impact there. I think this one's more debatable. I think the upside is greater on the current group, but I think the floor was higher with last year's group for 2 reasons. One is you had more consistently long production, where Devontae Smith was better last year at Bama than what Jordan Clark ever was at Arizona State. Jordan Clark played for like 4 years at Arizona State. before coming to Notre Dame. And R.J. Oben had played a lot more at Duke than what Jared Dawson has so far at Louisville. And then same thing with Rod Hurd compared to Jalen Stroman, where Rod Hurd's not coming off of an injury the way that Jalen Stroman was. Rod Hurd wasn't here last spring because he was still finishing up getting his master's from Northwestern. So I say the floor is higher than with last year's group. I'm more certain that, like, okay, we knew what they were going to do, and I think they kind of lived up to that floor. This year's group, it's like R.J. Oben was going to play for this team. I don't know that you can say that about Elijah Hughes. I don't even know that you can definitely say that about Jared Dawson if he doesn't come out and earn it. He's going to have to keep earning it. R.J. Oben was going to play last year. You didn't have the ability for him not to play because of your depth. Before the season even started, you didn't have a lot of big ends. You had a bunch of Vipers, but you have a bunch of big ends. And so I think the floor last year was higher. I think the upside of this group is higher. So I think there's more debate here, Trev. What say you about this comparison?
It is, and it's so tough because the defense last year was really hurt by injuries over the course of the season, and we know what impact the transfer portal class had. Whereas this year, if some of the defensive players that Notre Dame got in the transfer portal, if the people around them in the rotation or in front of them in the rotation gets hurt, there's still more there. What I mean by that is, you look at a guy like Jordan Clark who started at nickel last year, but then the Stanford game, Ben Morrison goes to the locker room with what I'm assuming to be that's when he found out that he injured his hip. And he was missing for most of the second half. Christian Gray was ruled out hours before kickoff. You start a true freshman for the first time. When Ben Morrison goes to the locker room, Jordan Clark becomes your boundary corner at 5'10", maybe 5'10". And then he proceeded to start
in cleats.
Helmet on maybe. But then you look at the defensive line. Like you brought up, R.J. Oben didn't have the super flashy plays like what we saw him have at Duke. But with all the injuries that happened along that defensive line, what happens if you take R.J. Oben out of it? No idea. No idea. I mean, are you starting Bryce Young every game? Do you move him to big end? Is it just Bryce Young and Josh Burnham and Junior Tuialamaka? Logan Thomas at times?
Josh Burnham, who also missed several games. He got hurt against Northern Illinois, didn't come back until Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
What would you have done then?
Yeah. It's so tough. Even with a guy like Rod Hurd, they brought in safeties in both classes. Rod Hurd last year, and then they brought in Jalen Stroman this year. Xavier Watts and Adon Schuler, for as many snaps as they had, Rod Hurd still had to rotate in. At times in the postseason, they were playing three safeties. There were times against Penn State and against Penn State and Ohio State, there's moments where all three guys were on the field at the same time. There's a scenario where Notre Dame plays three safeties on the field this year, and Jalen Stroman might not be in that mix. Rod Hurd was more the necessity to have to come in because Luke Talich might not have been ready, because Bronte Johnson was injured for most of the season, because Jadon Blair wasn't on campus yet. And so it's really tough. I think that's what makes this the most debatable, because we know what the impact was for this past class due to the injuries. Whereas if I put the same injuries and project that onto the 2025 class, they're more apt to handle them. And so I think that's what makes this conversation so interesting.
Here's another interesting part, and Jason Smith just brought this up, and we haven't really talked about this a whole lot, but I think it's definitely worth talking about. Everybody's like, coaches are never make mistakes. They never make mistakes. I'm like, well, yeah, they do. Even this staff. Jason said, I think we could have gotten the same production from Nana had he stayed that we got from RJ. But can't deny he showed up in a huge moment when needed. And I would argue that I don't even think that's debatable for two reasons. Number one is Nana was more productive last year at Notre Dame, significantly more so than what R.J. Oben was this year for Notre Dame. So R.J. Oben in his 1 year at Notre Dame had 19 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, and 1 sack. Nana, the year before, as the backup to Javonte, had 20 tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks in only 12 games because he didn't play the bowl game. RJ did that in 16 games. And then when Nana went to TCU this year, he had 38 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. I don't think there's any debate that they made a mistake not bringing Nana back. No question that Nana was a better player than RJ Oben. I don't know that I would have agreed with that a year ago. This is why I say sometimes it's like I'm not that part of the reason I don't bring it up and bang on them for it is because I don't like being critical of something, especially doing it harshly when I didn't have a problem with it at the time. Now, if I'd have said, like, this is a mistake, you guys are totally screwing up by bringing in RJ Oben and let Nana walk. I mean, I think it's like, okay, let's see, because Nana was a really solid backup. My hope would have been, why not have them both play that position? You know, like, but if I wasn't willing to hammer you for it at the time, then I'm not going to hammer you for it now. I'll mention it, but I think that's a great observation by Jason. I do think it ended up being a mistake to not keep Nana, who was a much better player in a Notre Dame uniform than RJ Oben was. But when he transferred to TCU, he was even more productive because he got more opportunities. Imagine if Notre Dame would have had a starting defensive end last year who had 38 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks compared to what they got from the starter this year. That'd have been huge. But that's the thing. Coaches aren't infallible. And that's not me, crush, these coaches are stupid. It happens. Everyone makes bad evaluations. And sometimes it's like, it wasn't even a bad evaluation. It just, just a guy had something you didn't think he had. And that's why we haven't brought it up a ton. And that's why I have yet to really, but freaking Al Washington, I can't believe he did that. Because I didn't think it was a mistake at the time. I was like, well, we'll see. But RJ Oben was a more productive player in his career at Duke than Nana was at Notre Dame. I mean, that's it. So that's why we haven't brought it up. But it is interesting to think about, had they just not brought in RJ Oben or brought in RJ and then still kept Nana, what that would have looked like. That'd have been very interesting. But I am happy for Nana because that kid gave me everything he had. And he was considered a team leader too, which is interesting as well. So, but yeah, so it is kind of an interesting conversation to have. But when I look at it though, what RJ Oben was not what we hoped he would get. And you hope that won't be true of the defensive line class this year. We hope that we're not looking back saying, well, you might have been better off keeping so-and-so or playing so-and-so more because Jared Dawson wasn't what we hoped he would be. Hopefully he steps up. And that's when we're talking about this comparison is, can this group be more impactful than what last year's group was? And that's kind of where it is. And that's where my expectations are higher. Because when I look at this defense, like you said, Trev, the floor, you knew what you were going to get to some degree with Jordan Clark. And he was a little better than I thought, but he was kind of, the limitations he had at Arizona State, we also saw at times at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
USC especially kind of was like, okay, we can really run, and it was a little bit tougher for him in that game than it was in some of the other games. Do I think Jalen Stroman has a higher ceiling than Rod Hurd? I absolutely do. But is he going to be healthy? Is he going to be able to make it through a whole season? He's coming off of a season-ending injury where he played one game. Rod Hurd was coming off, and he had played like 2,000 snaps in his career. He was very dependable. And that's where I say, that floor part comes in the conversation. But I think the success of this class on defense is going to come down to what do you get from Jared Dawson and what do you get from Devontae Smith? I think ultimately, if those two guys hit and they simply are what they were at their previous schools, this defensive class will be better than last year's, even if Jalen Stroman doesn't play. Even if Elijah Hughes doesn't play, those two guys have a chance at positions of need that if they're just what they were, if Jared Dawson just repeats what he did last year and Devontae Smith repeats what he did last year just on more snaps, it's a better defensive portal class, which then in turn makes it a better overall portal class, taking away quarterback from the conversation. You agree with that assessment, Trev? Or do you think they need more than those two to really step up and thrive?
No, I agree with that. I was actually going to ask you a question, and I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this. So you can go back and
Trev, we're not at the mailbag yet, buddy.
Oh, that's true.
Go.
When you, I should log onto my YouTube account and just put one in.
That'd be pretty awesome.
So when you go back and you look at these portal classes, there is always, and you could maybe say with the exception of 2021, but I'd also hear out arguments for Kane Madden. There's always somebody that comes in the portal class that kind of goes overlooked or not talked about as much, that ends up performing higher than what people would have thought. Last year you had Jordan Clark. There was a lot of that conversation surrounding Javonte Jean-Baptiste in 2023 when he came into Notre Dame. Good player along the defensive line. I don't think people were expecting him to have the season that he did have.
It was a hope. It was a hope. It was definitely not an expectation because he hadn't done it. Right.
In 2022, you had Chris Smith, who became a valuable asset to the D-line rotation. And then in 2020, at least for me, maybe you might have at the time, but I didn't think Nick McLeod was going to be as impactful as he was. It ended up being a great pickup. But question is do you think this class has that kind of player that you don't think
defense,
much of that performs higher than, or is the ceiling so high that if they do just play the way that you think that they will, it won't be a surprise? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I would say the only guy that has that chance is Elijah Hughes. Because if Jared Dawson, Archer in the chat just asked, Jared Dawson had 19 tackles last year and 4 sacks. If he repeats that, do you consider that a successful year? And my answer is, if he does it on the same number of snaps, absolutely. It's a successful year, because that's you have to look at that. So when you look at, for example, Howard Cross this season for Notre Dame, and you look at the production he had this season, well, Howard Cross had more production, obviously, than what Jared Dawson did. And we thought that he had a disappointing season. I mean, Howard Cross this year had 28 tackles. That's 9 more. He played 13 games. That's 9 more than what Jared Dawson had last year. He had 5.5 tackles for loss. I'm pulling up Jared Dawson's statistics from last season because I want to get that real quick. So Jared Dawson had 6.5 tackles for loss. Howard Cross had 5.5. That's comparable. He had 4 sacks. Howard Cross had 4 sacks. So you're basically saying, well, statistically, he basically is just replacing what Howard Cross did. Here's the big difference, though. Jared Dawson did all that in 239 snaps, or actually that was the 290 snaps last season, 294 snaps. Howard Cross did that on 585 snaps. So you look at Jared Dawson's production and you say his and I wrote an article about this, his per snap production last year was significantly better than what Howard Cross's was. If you look at his snaps last year, or even his total pressures last year, Howard Cross had 22, Jared Dawson only had 12, but Jared Dawson did that on 294 snaps. He would have had 24 pressures had he played the same number of snaps as Howard Cross. But if you look at his snap production from the year before, he had 16 pressures on 239 snaps, and if you give him the same number of snaps as Howard Cross, that's 39 pressures, which is more than what Howard Cross had the year before when he was actually really good. So his per snap production is better. The reason that I would say it's still a good year is because you don't need him to play the numbers that Howard Cross played snaps-wise. If you were in a situation where you had similar depth concerns at tackle that they did when Howard Cross was a standout, then I'd be concerned about that, because it would mean he had that production on a bigger scale, which means he wasn't able to produce on a per snap basis the way you hoped he would do. And so if he played 500 some snaps and had 19 tackles and 4 sacks, I'd say it was a little bit of a disappointing season, just like last year was a disappointing season for Howard Cross. And Jared Dawson on 289 fewer snaps, I believe, if had only 9 fewer tackles, had 1 more tackle for loss, and the same exact number of sacks. So yeah, as long as he does it on the same number of snaps, I'm thrilled with that. But that's the point, is if Jared Dawson, let's just say he plays 350 snaps. I think he can handle 60 more snaps than he played last year. And I'm looking at it on the same number of games. So obviously I'm not talking about, he had, let's look at, so he had 294 snaps in 10 games. So let's say he is able to stay healthy and he plays 12 games. That's 350 snaps. I think he can certainly handle 350 snaps in the regular season. I think he could handle 370, 375. I think he could get to 30 snaps a game. And 30 snaps a game would get him to 360 at the end of the regular season. he should be able to play that much. And you'd hope that his production would stay on a per snap basis in a comparable zone. I don't need him to play much more than that, because then I think you get to the point of diminishing returns. And we did see that with Howard Cross at times. Once he got over a certain number of snaps, fourth quarter, he just wasn't as good because he'd wear down because he's a smaller player getting beat up. So, and the other thing about Jared Dawson is he's doing it with 15, 20 extra pounds compared to what Howard Cross is doing with it. So if he has a real productive season, and let's say he's able to do 30 snaps a game and he finishes with 8 tackles for loss and 5 sacks, okay, that's kind of what I think he's capable of.
Yeah.
If Devontae Smith is just the best nickel that Notre Dame has had, okay, well, that's kind of what I expect him to be. If Jalen Stroman plays like a all-ACC caliber player, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of what he was at Virginia Tech before he got hurt. The only guy that I don't really have a lot of expectations for, to your point, Trev, because that's the premise, is like, like I thought Nick McLeod was a great pickup. He was definitely better than I thought he was going to be, because I remember watching him get torched by Clemson. Like, I think it was the year before, maybe the year before, like 2 years before. But I remember watching him just get destroyed by Clemson. He just couldn't run with their corners. I was like, he'll be better than what they were going to have, but he was better than I thought he was going to be. To your point, Chris Smith, I was like, this guy's going to be like a scout team player. And he was a very important part of your rotation. Just going through, like you said, Trev, every year they've had that kind of guy, except for 21, but they only had 2 pickups that year. 2023, I hoped that Javonte Jean-Baptiste could be that, but I would not have predicted 10.5 tackles for loss. And he was a lot like Khalid Kareem in that when he had sacks, they were like clutch, important money sacks. And then, like you said, last year with what we saw last year. So Elijah Hughes is really the only guy on defense that has that ability for me, because he's the only guy that I don't have any expectations for.
Sure.
If he steps up and he's like giving you like Donovan Heinisch type of snaps and he's a good, solid player, I'm like, dude, that's a bonus. That's better than what I thought he could be. And the only guy that I could see being like that on offense is Ty Washington. And I think, but doesn't that speak to the whole, I'd like to know your opinion on that, Trev, but I also would like to follow up with this but doesn't that speak to why I think this has a chance to be the best portal class? Is because my expectations are higher, and it's not based on what I hope that they'll do, but just we've already seen it. We're like, we hung all of our hopes on Chris Mitchell on what he did in one game at Arkansas the year before. And we just hope that would project. Now, I still believe with what you and I saw on film from Chris, even though he wasn't great last year, and sometimes like his production would have been significantly better had he had a different quarterback. If he came in this year, I think his production would look a lot different than it did last year, because you have 2 quarterbacks that can throw the ball down the field. So with that being said, just looking at the production for what it was, it is what it is. It was built around hoping that he would be able to do at this level what he did at a lower level. Same with Jaden Harrison. I hope that he can be a better receiver than he was at Marshall, because he wasn't a very good receiver at Marshall. He's just kind of an average receiver at Marshall, but a really good return man. And that's what he was at Notre Dame. Kind of an average player, had his moments, but he's a really good return man. Bo Collins, steady player, solid player, try-hard guy, not a difference maker. Was hoping he could maybe play like he did in high school and not what he was, but he was what he was at Clemson. And so these guys, if they are what they were, are much better players. Will Pauling is better than any of those guys based on what he's already shown. If he's just the guy he was 2 years ago at Wisconsin. Tanner Mordecai at quarterback, Trev. He had Tanner Mordecai at quarterback. He's a much better player than any of the portal receivers they've landed so far. If Malachi Fields is just the exact same guy he was the last 2 years of Virginia, that's it. He's significantly better than any of the receivers they've had. And that's the whole point. Ben Skoranek was at Notre Dame when he was at Northwestern. Bo Collins was at Notre Dame when he was at Clemson. Jaden Harrison was at Notre Dame when he was at Marshall. The only guy that was not that was Chris Mitchell, who wasn't as good. But Chris Mitchell had one big year at FIU in 5. One. It was his last year. He was kind of like what he was the first 4 years he was at FIU. The difference now is if all these guys repeat what they've been, you're getting far more impact than you've gotten in the past, which is why I think ultimately this is going to go down as Notre Dame's best portal class. And the only thing that could keep it from that outside of injury, which you can't control, is that it still may not be good enough for them to be starters. That's the reality. Jared Dawson could be what he was at Louisville and still not be good enough to start on this defense. Jalen Stroman could be what he was in the ACC and it still not be good enough to start on this defense. Like Will Pauling could be everything he was 2 years ago at Wisconsin and it's still not enough to start on this offense. Like that's the difference for me, Trev.
Well, look, hear me out on this. I would go as far to say, now some of this is projecting what we believe Malachi Fields will do, Jaden Greathouse will do, and what Eli Raridan would do. There's a chance that Will Pauling just does what he did in 2024 at Wisconsin and could be the second best receiver pickup that they have. Like, let's just say that Will Pauling does in 2025 what Bo Collins did in 2024. Plays every game, healthy for all 16 games, answers the bell. He's a good blocker, catches a handful of touchdowns, 40-some-odd receptions for 400 yards. That matched with what we believe Jaden Greathouse and Malachi Fields would do, I believe, would make that more effective than what Bo Collins did a year ago as the number one boundary guy. Because that is kind of what I believe Notre Dame's offense could be. You know, a couple receivers around that 400 or 500 mark. Jaden Greathouse around that 700-yard mark. Malachi Fields around that 800, 900-yard mark, and a tight end around that 500-600-yard mark. That's what I believe could be what the final stat tally could look like if all of these things come to fruition. But that's, to your point, what I think is so exciting about this is Will Pauling might not even have to, I would love if he did, but might not even have to do what he did in 2023 for us to step away and be like, yo, Will Pauling was a really good pickup this year. It could just be what he did in 24 or what Bo Collins did in 2024. I think there is room for that conversation too. Obviously, I would love for him to do what he did at Wisconsin in 2023. Definitely more than capable of doing it because we watched him do it. But I think that speaks to the state of where this team is at. And that's such a good spot to be in. Such a good spot.
Somebody in the chat said Will Pauling has to show that what he did in 2023 wasn't a one-off. And I think to a degree that's fair. What my pushback would be, however, is that I don't think that you look at last year and say he was normal. He was the same guy he was the year before. He just didn't play as well. I think the difference is when you look at him this year, two things happened this year that were different than last year. Number one is there was a quarterback change after the third game. And the other issue is he got injured early in the year. If you look at what he was doing early in the season, he was on pace to have a comparable season to what he had before. And so I do think that he showed early last year, despite some quarterback issues, that he could be the same guy he was from the year before. And so, like, I'm looking at the numbers real quick. Like, he had 6 catches for 60 yards in the first game against Western Michigan. He had 4 for 48 in the next game again in a blowout win over South Dakota. He had 9 for 83 yards in a win over Alabama. And then he was not the same player. It was banged up against USC and Purdue, and then got injured again against Rutgers and had to come out. And then, of course, he misses the last 3 games of the year and just wasn't the same player. But he had 19 catches for 191 yards in the first 3 games. If you just kind of put that over the course of a full season, that's 70-some catches for 700-some yards. The yards per attempt weren't going to be nearly as good. But again, that can also be something that you look at and say that's also partly because the overall offense wasn't as good as it was the year before. So there's a lot of different things that you look at and you kind of factor that into the overall performance. But I think there's some truth to that is the volume. Can he be that volume type of player? The difference, though, to your point, Trev, which I think is a great point, is they don't need him to be that. They just need him to be a slightly better version of what he was. If he's just in between those 2 years, I think that's impactful for what the needs are. I think it was Archer that said that for them to need him to be what he was at Wisconsin 2 years ago, to need it, not that if he isn't, it's obviously huge, but to need it is a different story. If they need him to be that, that'd be a legitimate question. Was it a one-off? the schedule wasn't super great, and there's some different things that he had a big bowl game and those type of things. So the question would be is, okay, do you need him to be that? And the thing, they don't. I think they do need him to be better than what he was last year on a per catch basis. I think the catch numbers, Trevor, are fine. They need to be like around 12 per catch as opposed to 9,
Sure.
which is what he was last year. But they don't need him to catch 74 balls like he did the year before because they have Jordan Faison. They have Jaden Greathouse. They have Malachi Fields. They have Micah Gilbert. They have KK Smith. They have Cam Williams. They have, all the players that they have. They have a tight end like Eli Raridon. They are throwing the ball to Jeremiah Love out of the backfield. So I do think from an effectiveness standpoint, they do need him to be closer to what he was in 23. From a volume standpoint, I'm totally fine if he catches the ball around the number of times he did at Wisconsin. It could even be less. Like if he only catches 30 balls and he averages 13, 14 yards a catch, it's a heck of a year as being a part of the rotation. If he starts creeping up towards what he was 2 years ago, then that's like, holy moly, this offense is going to be really, really good. And so that's the difference. And so I think that's also different because you needed Chris Mitchell to be a dude for you last year. You don't need Will Pauling to be a dude for you. You needed Bo Collins to be a dude for you last year, just like you need Malachi Fields to be a dude for you this year. The difference is that Malachi has proven that he can be that. Bo, we hope he could be that. And so, but I still say Bo Collins is still the best portal pickup or receiver they've had, with all due respect to Ben Skoranek. He's still the best one they've had so far. So I think you nailed it, Trevor. I think the ceiling is the key. The ceiling of this group is great. And here's the deal. All these guys are going to have to get to their ceiling in order to play. Outside of Malachi Fields, none of these guys are going to play if they don't get closer to their ceiling because the talent around him is just so much better than it was before.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it really, really is. It really is. I want to just answer just a couple questions here, Trev. We don't have time for a full mailbag, but there were just a couple that I wanted to get to that are somewhat relevant to the conversation we had earlier.
Yeah.
Gabe Weiss says that says how close behind is Greathouse to Fields, and just kind of like overall production. And they're different players. That's the first part, is they're different players. But from an overall production standpoint, I will not be shocked if Jaden Greathouse is Notre Dame's best receiver this year. I won't be shocked by it. The reason that there's two things though. Number one is he's not a boundary, and they need a boundary to complement what he can do as a field receiver, slot and a field receiver. So the focus on Malachi is also partly they can't ask Jaden to do every game what he did in the last two. Yeah. He's going to need that would make him one of the greatest receivers to ever play the game if he does that every week. I mean, he's winning the Blitnikoff. I mean, he's a first-round pick. I mean, it's not – you can't ask him to do that. It's unfair to ask anybody to do that in an offense like this. But he's also, if they're going to make another run, you're going to need to have some complementary weapons around him, and they need a boundary receiver for this offense, especially because you don't have Riley Leonard to carry the offense with his legs the way you did last year. You're going to need whoever your quarterback is to be more effective from the pocket than what Riley was last year. It's a need, not a want. It's a need because they're not Riley Leonard. And so you're going to need that boundary to step up more than you did last year. So that's really what it comes through, Gabe, is there's a scenario where the nature of the position has Malachi Fields catching more balls for more yards. But when you really evaluate the season, you're like, yeah, but Jaden was the dude. He was their clutch guy. He's the one that went off against that big-time team, even though Malachi caught more balls because he was the boundary, which is just going to get targeted more. And up until the last two games, Bo Collins was their leading receiver all year until the last two games.
Yeah.
So I could see that. The ideal, however, is that that Malachi is as good as we hope he could be, and Jaden is as good as we hope he can be. In that scenario, Malachi has more yards, Jaden might have more catches and even more touchdowns, but they're a great complement to each other as opposed to this guy's better than that guy, whatever. It's just because it's different. But I don't think that, Gabe, that Jaden is necessarily behind Malachi other than just proven production over a period of time. I just wanted to be clear on that because he's more proven. He has over 1,600 yards the last 2 years, and Jaden Greathouse is at like 800 or 900. That's the difference to me, on top of just they're different types of players. But will you, at the end of the year, Trev, will you be shocked if Jaden Greathouse at the end of the year is just kind of your best player?
No, not at all, man. When I look at these two guys, I think that Fields, from a number standpoint, will produce the most consistent numbers week in and week out. I think there's going to be more variance with Greathouses.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you go to the end of the season, it could be a situation where Jaden Greathouse has more 100-yard games, but then Jaden Greathouse might also have more games under 50 than what Malachi Fields did. I could see it very much being something like that, where week in and week out, I think we're going to get to the point in the middle of the season where you just know Malachi Fields is going to be good for 5 catches for 75 yards. I think that's just going to become a constant. And whereas Jaden Greathouse, depending on the week, you could have, 4 for 35, but 3 of them go for first downs.
Right.
Or he could have the game where he has 7 for $110 and a touchdown. Like
he goes 4 for 50, but 3 of them for 40 yards are on the final game-winning drive of the game, like you saw to a degree against Penn State, where he had the big play. But think about the clutch plays he made on that final drive of the game. They're not sexy yards. It was like 2 catches for 13 yards, but they were both third down conversions that got him in field goal range. That's the difference. Where Malachi has that big play, you remember that 50-yard bomb for a touch. You remember that one. Yeah. But those ones set up that one, or those, so it's just different. It's different. So I think, Gabe, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to address that before we get out of here and get to that, so we're not going to be able to get to a mailbag today. We have somebody coming over here to do some, our water softeners on the fritz. So we have somebody coming over and he's getting here now. So we are not going to be able to get to the mailbag today, but we will have our BISA hold tomorrow. So make sure you check that out. If you're a member, go on there, leave your submissions. I believe Salty's already started it. But we'll have a mini mailbag on Thursday. We're going to talk about some newcomers on Thursday. We're also going to talk on Thursday about the Andy Staples released his preseason, his post-spring top 25. He's got Notre Dame number 2. I want to talk about that and some other rankings in there that I thought were interesting. So we'll kind of dissect his top 25, have some fun with that on Thursday as well. Then, of course, Friday's the big boy, the big mailbag, which I'm excited about. So got all that this week. We're going to be busy. So, folks, do us a favor. On your way out, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. But best way to support us, be part of our community, engage in the conversation, ask all the questions you asked in the chat I couldn't get to. Y'all, if you put them on the board, I'm going to address them and get to them. So you're going to throw those on there. But you can only do that at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Have an awesome rest of your day, everybody. 5 o'clock tonight, IB Nation Sports Talk. Sean is going to be talking with someone from Syracuse, talking about Steve Angeli, and, of course, Notre Dame plays Syracuse this year. Syracuse got another portal pickup during the show, Cam Pringle from South Carolina. So you want to be prepared for that as well. So until next time, that's Trevor. I'm Brian. Have an awesome rest of your day, and we'll see you guys again soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.